The hallway at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like industrial bleach and something underneath it, the copperpenny scent of old blood that never quite washed away, no matter how many times the housekeeping staff scrubbed. Ashley Cooper knew that smell the way she knew the sound of her own breathing. 4 counts in. 4 counts hold. 4 counts out. The cadence had kept her alive in Marjah 20 years ago, and it kept her invisible now, moving through the surgical unit's fluorescent corridors with the grey presence of someone who had learned long ago that being noticed was dangerous. Her scrubs were pressed sharp enough to cut. Her name badge hung at precisely 45 degrees. Her hands, which trembled sometimes when she was alone, a barely perceptible flutter that felt like her own body betraying her, were steady as she pushed the medication cart through OR2's hallway. 1 foot in front of the other. Controlled. Disciplined. The way they had trained her to move when every mistake meant someone's sister didn't come home. She pushed through the double doors into the pre-op staging area, and the morning light hit her face. Her eyes, grey as Baltic water, a color that made residents do double takes before they looked away, scanned the room. Exits. 2. Ventilation shaft above the supply cabinet. Window overlooking the parking lot, reinforced glass, alarmed. Her mind catalogued these things without her permission, the way it always did. Habit. Or training. She could no longer tell which was which. The locker room was empty at 6:38 a.m., exactly how she liked it. 15 lockers in a row, and she used the one in the corner, back to the wall, view of the entrance. She hung her personal bag on the top hook and reached for the bottom shelf where she kept her shoes. The boots were there, where they always were. Tan leather, scuffed at the heels from 14,000 kilometers of walking through dust that never settled. The laces were frayed. The soles were worn through at the ball of the foot from the weight of carrying a man, Rashid, the translator with the hole in his chest and the will to live that had outlasted the bleeding, 3 miles through contact fire toward a landing zone that was supposed to be secure. Her fingers touched the leather like it might disappear if she wasn't careful. The boots were the only physical proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper had ever existed. The government had erased everything else. The records, the deployments, the photographs, the names of the 12 operators who had died in Operation Serpent's Tail. Erased so completely that even the official phone number had been disconnected. When the classified operation had gone catastrophically wrong, when the extraction had turned into a bloodbath, when 3 of her team died in the exfiltration, the decision was made at a level so high that Ashley didn't even know who made it. Bury it. Bury all of them. Or at least bury their evidence. She had been given a new name. Ashley Cooper was real enough, but constructed like a stage set. A forged nursing diploma from Georgetown. Instructions to go grey. Instructions never to surface. Instructions to be the kind of person who existed only in the space between moments, noticed by no one, remembered by nothing. She had done exactly that for 20 years. 12 different hospitals across the southeast. Never more than 2 years in one place. Never long enough to develop patterns that might be recognized. Never close enough to anyone to answer difficult questions. Now she was here at Oak Creek Memorial, and the boots stayed in her locker because they were safer hidden than worn. She touched them once each morning, just to confirm they were real. Just to confirm that some part of her, the part that had made corpsmen weep and had carried wounded soldiers through fire, still existed somewhere beneath the scrubs and the meticulous charting and the way she made herself small in break rooms. She laced her work shoes, her hands moving through the motions automatically, and headed to the surgical unit. The morning briefing was in 15 minutes. Dr. Hargrove would be there, his silver hair catching the overhead lights like a crown, his hands manicured, his voice carrying the particular contempt of someone who had never been wrong in his own estimation. Ashley had learned to read men like Hargrove the way she had learned to read weather systems and enemy movement. He was the type who needed to diminish people to feel large. It was a recognizable weakness, and in her experience, recognizable weaknesses were often the gateway to understanding how someone thought. The surgical unit hummed with early morning energy. Nurses moved between stations. A junior resident reviewed charts at the central desk. Two surgical techs were setting up ORs, one for the first case of the day, Mrs. Chen, 73, cholecystectomy, routine procedure. The kind of surgery that should never have complications. The kind of surgery where someone like Ashley, who had learned to notice discrepancies the way hounds noticed blood in water, could usually spot problems before they became emergencies. She was standing at the supply station, organizing instruments into the sterile field, when Dr. Hargrove walked past. He was flanked by 3 junior residents, the kind of doctors who still believed their diplomas meant something, who hadn't yet learned that a medical degree was just permission to learn what you didn't know. Hargrove moved like a man who had never questioned his own authority. His shadow fell across the instrument tray. "Miss Cooper," he said, and the way he said it, not her name, just Miss, made it clear he had never bothered to learn it. She looked up. Her face was blank. Professional. The face she had worn for 2 decades of making herself disappear. "I noticed you've been reviewing the post-operative documentation again. All this meticulous charting. Commendable, though perhaps a touch obsessive rather than thorough, wouldn't you say?" The 3 residents watched her. One of them, dark hair, residency year 1 written all over him, looked uncomfortable. The other 2 smiled the way people smile when someone else is being diminished and they are relieved it isn't them. "Documentation should be precise, Doctor," Ashley said. Her voice was soft. Deferential. The voice she had rehearsed 1,000 times in apartment bathrooms and parking lots. "Precision prevents errors." "Precision," Hargrove repeated, and his smile sharpened. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's the mark of someone who doesn't quite trust the people around her. Rather paranoid, one might think. Though I suppose nursing has its own anxieties." He turned to the residents. "Come on. Mrs. Chen is already prepped in OR 1. Let's not waste surgical time with preliminary gossip." They moved past her like a school of fish, and Ashley returned to the instruments without changing her breathing pattern. "For counts in. For counts hold. For counts out." The tremor in her hands that sometimes appeared when she was alone didn't manifest now. There was no point in trembling. Trembling was for people who still believed the world was fair enough to warrant an emotional response to insults. What she had noticed, though, was something else entirely. She had seen the post-op billing codes for Mrs. Chen's case yesterday, and something had bothered her enough to pull the surgical records again this morning. The codes didn't match the procedure. Cholecystectomy was supposed to be simple, gallbladder removal, standard laparoscopic approach, documented recovery time of approximately 4 hours. But the billing codes that had been submitted to Medicare included codes for a bile duct exploration procedure that would require 30 additional minutes and a completely different skill set. The kind of code that could justify a higher surgical fee, especially to an insurance company that rarely looked closely at what a hospital actually did. She had seen this pattern before, in 6 different hospitals across 3 states. It was always small. It was always subtle. And it was always lucrative if you knew how to work the system without triggering audits. A discrepancy here, a phantom procedure there, all adding up to hundreds of thousands of dollars in billing that didn't correspond to actual patient care. This was the kind of thing that got people fired. Not for any noble reason, but because hospitals protected themselves before they protected anything else, and if someone like Ashley, someone meticulous enough to notice, quiet enough to ask questions without immediately alerting everyone in the room, started flagging discrepancies, it would eventually force someone to either fix the problem or silence the person who saw it. She knew which option most administrators would choose. She had learned that lesson in Marjah when asking the wrong questions to the wrong people had resulted in Operation Serpent's Tail becoming a burial site instead of a success. The 12 dead operators had asked questions. Some of them had refused orders. Some of them had insisted on verifying intelligence that turned out to be compromised. The government had responded by erasing them. All of them. And then it had given Ashley a new name and instructions to disappear. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the young Afghan-American man currently wheeled into pre-op for an emergency appendectomy, the one being transferred into OR's 3 at this very moment, was the same translator who had survived because Ashley had carried him through 3 miles of open ground with a sucking chest wound and the kind of will that made death reconsider. Rashid had been given a new life. A visa. American citizenship. A military career with the 75th Ranger Regiment, where he had become the kind of operator who could teach other soldiers how to survive things that shouldn't be survivable. He was sedated now, being prepped for a routine appendectomy. Ashley was setting instruments in OR 3. And Dr. Hargrove was standing in the doorway, his hand on the surgical suite door, with the calm confidence of a man who had never been held accountable for anything in his life. The next voice Ashley heard was the intercom cracking. All staff, 10-minute warning. Surgical slate on schedule. She moved with the precise efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, her hands positioning instruments along the sterile field, sutures, clamps, retractors, hemostats, arranged in the order they would be needed. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, their frequency set at 60 Hz, a sound most people never heard but that she heard constantly, like the hum of a nervous system that could never quite relax. Dr. Hargrove would perform the surgery in approximately 90 minutes. The billing codes would be submitted. And Ashley Cooper, Senior Chief Petty Officer who had died in an operation that never happened, who carried only the memory of combat boots and the faces of dead soldiers, would continue to chart everything she observed, because precision prevented errors, and some mistakes were too expensive to let pass unnoticed. She had learned that lesson in blood. She was learning it again in the sterile silence of OR's 3, surrounded by the tools of healing, serving a man who didn't know she had saved his life once before and might need saving again. That was when her phone vibrated silently in her pocket. A message. A single word that made her breath catch for just an instant before the 4-count rhythm reasserted itself, Valkyrie. The board was already there when Ashley clocked in at 0600, before the day shift nurses had even arrived for their briefing. Red marker. Bold capital letters. A medical error flag that didn't exist. Medication error, A. Cooper. Morphine discrepancy. Third shift. 200 micrograms unaccounted for according to the handwritten note scrawled beneath her name. Ashley stood in front of the unit board, still in street clothes, watching the fluorescent lights cast everything in a clinical pallor that made the red letters look like an accusation written in blood. By the time the first families arrived at visiting hours, 43 people would walk past that board. By lunch, 112. She reached for the marker to check the log, to find the documentation, to do what she always did, prove the discrepancy was a charting error, a transposition, a misread of the digital pharmacy records. That's when she felt Dr. Hargrove's presence behind her, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne, the kind that costs more than her monthly rent. She didn't turn around. Didn't rush. Just let one measured breath cycle through her lungs. Troubling, isn't it? His voice had that practiced tone, the one he used in the surgical theater when he wanted the residents to feel his disappointment like a physical weight. An inexplicable pharmaceutical loss on your shift. The DEA takes these very seriously, Nurse Cooper. As do I. Ashley turned slowly. Hargrove stood with his arms crossed, his tailored suit catching the light like armor. This was stage 2 of his escalation, no longer just dismissive, now strategic. He was documenting. Building a record. The kind of carefully placed accusations that hospital administrators couldn't ignore, even if they wanted to. His eyes held the calculated satisfaction of a man who'd learned exactly which pressure points would break people. The discrepancy doesn't exist, Doctor. Her voice stayed level. I can pull the pharmacy records from my entire shift. Every unit reconciled at 0600 when day shift relieved me. Can you? He smiled, but it was the smile of someone who already knew the answer would take 3 hours to assemble and would be read by people who'd already decided she was guilty. Then I suggest you do so. Immediately. Before your reputation becomes any more complicated. He walked past her toward the surgical wing, and she watched him go, understanding the geometry of what was happening. The board. The accusation. The demand for documentation that would consume half her shift. By the time she cleared her name, 3 families would have requested different nurses. 2 colleagues would have started avoiding eye contact. And Hargrove would have moved on to the next stage, already confident she was marked. The 3 hours came and went. The morphine records checked out perfectly. Ashley printed the pharmacy reconciliation, the time-stamped signatures, the proof that nothing was missing. She walked it to Hargrove's office and found him meeting with the board chairman, David Sterling, a man whose silver hair and cufflinks screamed old money. Hargrove glanced up, saw the stack of papers, and his expression shifted into something that looked almost like disappointment, as if he'd hoped the documentation would be messier. "Thank you, Nurse Cooper," he said, barely glancing at the proof. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." But the board stayed up. Someone had to have made the error, the implication hanging in the silence. And even though she'd proven herself right, the doubt remained like a stain that didn't wash out. By day 3, it was the patient room where everything accelerated. Corporal Yasir Rahman lay in post-op recovery, his sister Amira sitting beside him with the protective posture of someone who'd learned early to defend the people she loved. His vitals were stable, blood pressure 128/72, oxygen saturation 96%, heart rate 68. A perfect recovery from a routine appendectomy. Ashley was checking his dressing, documenting the color and consistency of the drainage, when Hargrove appeared in the doorway with the attending surgeon following in his wake like a satellite pulled by gravity. "Nurse Cooper." His voice cut through the quiet like a scalpel. "When you're finished hovering, perhaps you could explain why Mr. Rahman's dressing wasn't changed per protocol. Or is basic wound care beyond your capabilities?" The room went dead silent. Amira's hand tightened on her brother's shoulder. A family waiting for comfort instead got a public interrogation. Ashley felt the moment crystallize. This wasn't about the dressing. This was about an audience. About making her small in front of people who would tell others, who would reshape the story into something darker with each retelling. She took one measured breath. Let it expand through her chest the way the instructors had taught her, back when controlled breathing meant the difference between detecting an ambush and walking into one. The combat boots in her locker. The pair she'd worn through Marjah in 2004. The ones that had carried her through situations that required something far more brutal than explaining wound care protocols. The dressing was changed at 0600, doctor, as documented in the chart you're holding. Her voice stayed quiet. Precise. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and finding out you could survive it again. Temperature at that time was 98.6 Fahrenheit. No erythema. Minimal serous drainage. All values within normal post-operative parameters. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then perhaps your documentation skills need review, discount nurse. That's when the tear came. Not from fear or humiliation, but from something deeper, the muscle memory of restraint, of watching worse things happen to better people and being trained not to flinch. She let it trace down her cheek. One single tear, perfectly placed, perfectly controlled. Then she wiped it without breaking eye contact, her gaze steady as a laser on Hargrove's face for exactly 3 seconds longer than was comfortable. Amira's protective posture shifted. Her eyes moved from Hargrove to Ashley and back again. She leaned toward her brother and whispered something Ashley didn't hear, but she saw the change in family dynamics, the question forming about who to trust in this room. "Mr. Rahman," Ashley said, turning to him with complete focus, "your vitals are excellent. Pain management, do you need anything adjusted? Your sister, I know they're probably sharing stories about the food here. Can I bring you anything else?" She'd given him an ally without saying it directly. A reminder that she was the one asking about his well-being while the other man was interrogating his nurse. Hargrove stood there for another moment, realizing the conversation had shifted, then left without another word. By day 5, the isolation had deepened into something almost geological. Ashley would walk into the break room, a small space with a refrigerator that hummed like a low-frequency warning and a single table with chairs that scraped against linoleum like reluctant witnesses, and within 30 seconds, conversations would stop. Within 45 seconds, at least 2 people would find urgent reasons to leave. By day 6, when she sat down with her dying succulent plant and the sandwich she'd made at home because the hospital cafeteria had become a minefield of whispered asides, the room simply emptied. She didn't fight it. Senior chief petty officers in her former life didn't take things personally, they took things professionally. Hargrove was isolating her, and that was fine. It meant she was exactly where he needed her, alone, visible, vulnerable by appearance if not by fact. And then, on day 7, he made his final move before escalation. Shift change. 1,400 hours. The surgical floor was in that transition state where the morning's cases were being closed and the afternoons were being prepped. Ashley was restocking a crash cart when Hargrove's voice carried across the prep area, not shouted, just loud enough that everyone could hear. Nurse Cooper. A moment. 12 surgical staff members froze. Residents. Technicians. Attending physicians. The room became a stage and she was suddenly the center of a spotlight she didn't consent to. Hargrove stood by the supply room with a state nursing investigator he golfed with twice monthly, a man named Victor Caldwell whose business cards listed his authority as if it were a weapon. "We need to discuss the fentanyl discrepancy from your last 3 shifts," Hargrove said conversationally, as if he were asking about her weekend. "Controlled substances are serious matters, as I'm sure you understand." Ashley took one measured breath. The kind of breath that carried the weight of training, of situations where the wrong reaction meant body bags and flag-folded funerals. She looked at each person in the room, really looked at them, and saw the calculation happening in real time. Guilt by accusation. Doubt by proximity. "I've been accused of many things, Doctor," she said, her voice dropping into a register that hadn't been used in 18 years but remembered every word, every tone, every implication of command. But theft was never one of them. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the ventilation system pushing processed air through the vents above them. 1 second. 2. 3. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. In that moment, something shifted in the room's understanding of who they were standing next to, a flicker of recognition that this woman was something other than the quiet nurse with careful hands and meticulous charts. Hargrove's face flushed. "The investigation continues." "Then I suggest you conduct it," Ashley said, already turning back to her crash cart, already moving on as if the conversation was finished because it was. She'd given them nothing. No anger. No tears. No defense that could be twisted. Just a woman who'd been tested before and found she was something harder than doubt could damage. But behind the scenes, in phone calls Hargrove made to Sterling and Caldwell and a third number that connected to a Pentagon office that officially didn't exist, the machinery of her destruction was already grinding into motion. The appendectomy was supposed to be routine. Corporal Yasir Rahman, sedated and draped, lay on the operating table in OR 3 like any other patient, a 34-year-old who translated for 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines in Helmand Province and survived the wars that killed better men. Nobody in the room knew he was the same translator Ashley had carried 3 miles through enemy fire with a sucking chest wound 18 years ago. He'd become a citizen. He'd become a ranger. He'd become someone else's patient, and that was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. Dr. Hargrove was closing at 2:17 p.m. The wound was clean, the appendix out, the patient stable on 1.8 liters of crystalloid and oxygen at 98% saturation. Standard closure. Bovie set to coagulation. The fluorescent lights cast that particular surgical white that made everything look sterile and inevitable. Then his scalpel nicked the inferior vena cava. It was the smallest gesture, a tremor in his right hand, almost nothing, just a 2-millimeter deviation from the planned line. The blade caught the vessel at an angle that made closure impossible. Dark blood began pooling in the retroperitoneal space. Slow at first. Then faster. The monitors didn't scream immediately. They whispered first, the way danger always does. Hargrove didn't move. Dr. Hargrove. The resident across from him was 26, blonde, competent. She stared at the pooling blood. "Doctor. Vena cava bleed." His hands were shaking now. visibly. The scalpel hung in his right hand like a thing that had decided to betray him. His jaw was tight, his breathing shallow. This was the moment. Ashley had seen it 1,000 times in combat, the precise instant when a man's mind decides to abandon him. When protocol dissolves into static. Ashley was in the gallery above, watching through the window, and her entire body recognized what she was seeing. Not a surgeon frozen. A human being drowning in real time while standing in a sterile field. The blood loss accelerated. 60 ccs to 90. The monitor began its crescendo, beeping faster, a machine trying to tell the room that something was dying. Blood pressure dropped from 118 to 104. The anesthesiologist called it out, pressure down. Loss approximated at 400 ccs, climbing. The resident reached for instruments, but Hargrove's trembling hand was in her way, and he wasn't moving. 140 ccs of blood. The pressure fell to 89. The patient's heart rate climbed to 118, 124, 131, tachycardic and panicking, even sedated, even unconscious, the body knowing it was dying. That was when cardiac tamponade began its work. The blood wasn't just hemorrhaging into the retroperitoneal space. Some of it was tracking into the pericardial sac, the membrane around the heart. Blood accumulating there didn't drain. It compressed. Every milliliter added pressure, squeezed the chambers, reduced how much blood the heart could actually pump. The monitors showed it first, a sudden drop in blood pressure to 76/42. Then the flattening of the waveform. Then the terrible, specific sound of a surgeon who was supposed to save a life standing absolutely still while that life was ending. Hargrove's face had gone grey. His mouth was open. The scalpel was still in his hand. Ashley moved. She didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She stripped off the surgical gown she'd been wearing. She'd been assisting in a routine laceration repair in the ER when Hargrove called her up to the gallery to observe, and moved toward the elevator with a stride that made the ER staff part like water. The elevator doors closed on her face. No expression. Just movement. Just purpose. 31 seconds from gallery to scrub sink. 9 seconds to double glove, surgical mask already on, antiseptic across her hands with the muscle memory of someone whose hands had done this 1,000 times before, whose hands had done worse in conditions that would make this sterile field look like the Taj Mahal. The OR doors hit her like an argument as she entered, and every face in that room turned toward her except one. Hargrove's eyes were still on the bleeding vena cava, on his hands, on the moment he had stopped existing as a functional human being. "Move," Ashley said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Her voice had dropped an octave from the deferential surgical nurse tone that had become her habit. The resident moved. The surgical tech moved. Hargrove stepped back, and that simple step was the entire confession of his career written in a single motion. The pericardial sac was distended, full of blood, compressing the right atrium. The pressure inside was probably 18 to 20 millimeters of mercury by now, high enough to make the heart mechanically unable to fill, unable to pump, unable to do the only thing it was built to do. Blood pressure was 58/34. The patient was minutes from arrest. Ashley's hands moved to the sterile field. The 25-gauge spinal needle was there, exactly where it should be. She located the angle, below the xiphoid process, 45 degrees toward the left shoulder, exactly at the intersection of the cardiac silhouette and the hemidiaphragm. The landmarks of anatomy that most surgeons in 2024 never needed to learn because they had echocardiography and anesthesia and time and resources and every advantage that existed in a modern OR. She had none of these things. She had 40 seconds. The needle entered the pericardial sac and found blood. Dark, deoxygenated, collecting in the wrong place. She drew it out, 5 ccs. Then 12. Then 28. The hiss of the syringe plunger, the specific sound of fluid leaving where it didn't belong. Blood pressure began to climb. 62, 68. 74, The monitors steadied their panicked screaming into something approaching a normal rhythm. "Fluid bolus," Ashley said. 2 liters wide open. "Prep for cardiothoracic. Get them on the phone now." "Yes," the resident whispered. "Not yes. Move." The resident moved. The tech called cardiothoracic. The anesthesiologist was already running the second full line. Blood pressure was at 82 now, climbing. O2 saturation was 96. The sinus rhythm appeared on the monitor, no longer the desperate arrhythmia of a dying heart, but the steady electrical signature of an organ that had been given time to function again. Ashley drew 1 final cc of blood from the pericardial sac, and then the needle was out. The crisis was stabilizing, and she was stepping back from the table while her hands had already stopped shaking because that wasn't trembling. That was precision. That was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and finding out that the worst was not the end. She was already at the door when she said it, "I'm going on break." Nobody laughed. The room was too full of the sound of a life that had almost ended, the smell of blood and antiseptic, the weight of realizing that the surgeon they'd been taught to trust had nearly killed a man and a nurse had saved him. Hargrove was still standing at the edge of the surgical field, his hands hanging at his sides like they belonged to someone else. But that wasn't the worst part. The ER was quiet when she walked through it, that particular silence that happened when news moved faster than gossip. A medication error fabricated in red marker. A fentanyl accusation in front of the entire surgical staff. A nurse who was clearly unraveling, clearly dangerous, clearly someone who should never have been hired. All of it had been so carefully crafted, so systematically delivered, that by the time most of Oak Creek Memorial heard about the pericardiocentesis, they'd already heard all the reasons why they shouldn't trust anything she'd done, should doubt everything she'd said, should be looking for errors in her charts from the past 3 months. The anesthesiologist followed her into the hallway at 2:58 p.m. Dr. Marcus Webb, 52, kind eyes, the type who actually cared about the people he worked with. That was field pericardiocentesis. Where in God's name did you learn that? Ashley kept walking. Another lifetime. He didn't ask what that meant. He was smart enough to understand that the answer wasn't a thing he was allowed to know. She felt his eyes on her for one more moment, that calculation happening in his brain, the gap between who she was supposed to be and who she'd just proved herself to be. Then she heard his footsteps turn back toward the OR, back toward the work, back toward the reality of a patient whose life had been saved by a woman the hospital was preparing to destroy. The locker room was empty. It was always empty at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, everyone still working, nobody needing their things. She opened her locker, 304, third row, always 304, and looked at what she'd accumulated in 4 months of existing as Ashley Cooper, registered nurse, civilian nobody. A pair of combat boots sat on the bottom shelf. Worn leather, laces still tied with the knot she'd used on FOB Shank 18 years ago, the knot you use when you're not sure if you're coming back. She'd kept them there every day, a single piece of evidence that she'd existed as something other than this. She didn't touch them. Not yet. At 3:15 p.m., Hargrove emerged from OR 3, his surgical gown already gone, his tie straightened to the point of obsessiveness. She watched him from the locker room doorway as he walked past, didn't acknowledge her, went directly to his office. She counted to 12. Then his phone rang. She could hear his voice from 40 feet away, loud enough to carry through the hospital's thin walls. "Doug, we have a liability situation. Nurse Cooper violated sterile protocol and performed an unauthorized procedure." His voice was exactly the texture of expensive damage control. "I need her suspended pending investigation. The state board needs to know we're taking this seriously." The second call came 9 minutes later, to a number she didn't recognize. She knew the voice that answered anyway, Rick Caldwell, the state nursing investigator Hargrove golfed with twice monthly. The arrangement was exactly as clean and as necessary as any good strategic partnership. "Rick, I'm flagging a concerning pattern. Medication discrepancies, erratic behavior. Today she forced her way into my OR without authorization. Can you expedite a license review?" "Not a request. A coordination. A man who'd built his entire career on the understanding that every powerful person in Savannah owed him something, and every medium powerful person was afraid of him. The third call made her breathe deeper. Not angry. Just different. A Virginia number. She'd memorized it when she submitted the falsified credentials for months ago. It rang twice and disconnected. That was the signal. That was the message going back to whatever government office officially didn't keep records about her, officially didn't acknowledge that Operation Serpent's Tail had ever happened or that 12 good operators had died in ways that couldn't be written in any official report. The hospital administrator's office was on the 4th floor. His name was Gerald Finch, 61, and he'd been summoned by Hargrove exactly the way you summon someone who exists in your orbit rather than his own. When Ashley arrived at 3:36 p.m., 2 security guards were already stationed outside his door. Not aggressive. Just there. Just making sure she understood that this was no longer her choice. Finch wouldn't meet her eyes. Effective immediately, you're terminated for gross insubordination and patient endangerment. Security will escort you out. The words came out pre-written, pre-authorized, the kind of words a man says when he's been told exactly what to say by someone who'd spent months building a network of obligation. Ashley nodded once. The walk to her locker took for minutes. She opened it again and pulled out the items that comprised her civilian life. A chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A dying succulent that she'd watered anyway, hoping. A photo of her spotter Rodriguez from 3rd Battalion, Rodriguez who died in her arms during the exfiltration she wasn't supposed to remember, whose face she kept because erasing it felt like a betrayal the government couldn't force her to complete. The combat boots she left behind. Too dangerous to carry. Too precious to abandon. Security walked her through the ER at 4:12 p.m., past colleagues who suddenly found their charts and their 4 lines and their patient monitors absolutely riveting. She felt their eyes, the calculated indifference, the way people learn to look at someone who's become radioactive. Dr. Hargrove watched from the 2nd floor window, his phone already dialed, already speaking into it with the satisfied tone of a man whose network was functioning exactly as designed. "I have a story about a dangerous nurse you should investigate," he was saying. "She almost killed a patient today and forced her way into a sterile OR. No, anonymous tip is fine. Just thought you'd want to know before she's contracted to somewhere else." The rain started as she hit the bus stop, sheets of it, the kind that hammered the Savannah asphalt like applause or like gunfire depending on what you'd heard before. The cardboard box holding her life was getting soaked. Her scrubs were getting soaked. A woman passing by, or older, kind-looking, the type who noticed things, made a small gesture like she wanted to help, then saw something in Ashley's face and decided against it. Ashley stood in the rain and stared at the contents of her civilian existence. The mug. The plant. The photograph of a man who couldn't be alive because the operation that killed him officially never happened. Somewhere in Virginia, a phone that had rung twice and disconnected was ringing again. Somewhere in Washington, someone was pulling files that she'd thought had been destroyed. Somewhere in this city, a network that had taken months to build was about to discover that the nurse they'd been destroying had a past worth destroying her for. The rain got heavier. Within the hour, Dr. Hargrove's hands had stopped shaking. Fear had crystallized into something sharper, necessity. He sat in his office with the door locked, his tie loosened, and made 3 phone calls that would have taken weeks to orchestrate if he hadn't spent the last 2 years building this network. The first call went to Marcus Sterling, the hospital board chairman, at 4:06 p.m. Sterling owed him. 2 years ago, Hargrove had written a 30-page incident report that classified a patient death as unavoidable complication secondary to pre-existing pathology, and instead of what everyone in the surgical suite knew it actually was, Sterling's drunk hand during a cosmetic revision. That report had cost Hargrove nothing but an afternoon's typing. It had saved Sterling's medical license. "Marcus, I need you to listen carefully," Hargrove said, and his voice carried the weight of a man calling in a debt written in blood. "The nurse on my surgical team today, a Cooper, she overstepped during an emergency. Insubordination. Potential protocol violations. I need the board to move on immediate termination before end of shift. Before she can file any grievance. Sterling's breathing on the other end was quick, defensive. James, what are you talking about? I heard she saved the patient. She violated the chain of command. Performing unsanctioned procedures without attending physician authorization. Hargrove's lie was wrapped in just enough medical language to sound credible. If there's any liability question, it traces back to hospital negligence. Unless we move now. The pause lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Sterling said, I'll call an emergency board session. 30 minutes. The second call went to Richard Olmsted at the State Nursing Board at 5:03 p.m. Olmsted and Hargrove golfed together on the second Tuesday of every month at Bacon Park. 18 holes. $3,000 bets. Olmsted always lost, and Hargrove always forgave the debt with a handshake. Richard, I'm filing a formal complaint. Controlled substance diversion. I'll have documentation by tomorrow, but I wanted to give you a heads up before the allegations hit your desk formally. Another lie, but one threaded carefully through implication. The nurse in question, Ashley Cooper, has been under my supervision for 6 weeks. Medications have gone missing during her shifts. Atypical prescribing patterns. I've documented everything. Olmsted made a sound like a man whose golf game had just cost him more than $3,000. Jesus, James. Are you sure about this? I wouldn't call if I weren't. I can fast-track an investigation. We could have a preliminary finding within 72 hours. The third call came at 5:19 p.m., and this one was different. No handshake debt. No implied threat disguised as concern. This was the call that made Hargrove's palm sweat even as his voice remained steady. A Virginia number. No name in his phone. Just 7 digits that he'd been given years ago with explicit instructions, use only if everything else fails. The voice that answered was clipped, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. Yes? This is Dr. James Hargrove, Oak Creek Memorial Hospital, Savannah. I'm calling to report an asset concern. The line went quiet. Then, identify yourself by protocol. Hargrove recited a string of numbers he'd memorized 2 decades ago and then tried to forget. A security code from a different era. A different world. Another pause. The asset in question? Potential exposure. The asset may have surface-level interaction with a compromised individual. I'm reporting to ensure containment. He was speaking about Ashley Cooper in the coded language of people who deal in ghosts. Asset. Exposure. Containment. The voice on the other end made a notation. He could hear the keystroke. The asset is no longer our concern, the voice said finally. Any civilian complications are your responsibility to manage. Understood, Hargrove said, but the line had already disconnected. The call had rung twice and died. That was protocol. That was how dead people handled phone calls. Hargrove set down the receiver and waited. Within the hour, Oak Creek Memorial security chief received a call from the hospital administrator directing him to escort a terminated employee from the building. No explanation. Just an order, authorized at board level. By 6:16 p.m., 2 security officers in gray uniforms arrived at the surgical unit with a cardboard box and a document stamped with the hospital's seal. Ashley was in the locker room, changing out of her scrubs. She'd already known what was coming. She could read hospital politics the same way she could read wind direction for a shot. The way Sterling had refused to make eye contact during rounds. The way Hargrove had arranged his schedule to avoid passing her in corridors. The signature of an operation in motion. When the security officers appeared in the doorway, she was already dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a gray cardigan, athletic shoes that had carried her through markets in Kandahar and surgical wards in Savannah with identical precision. Ms. Cooper? The younger officer held the box like it contained something fragile. We're going to need to escort you from the building. She took the box without speaking. Her combat boots were still in the locker. She'd left them there deliberately, months ago. Sometimes the right message was the one you didn't deliver. The boots would stay. They belonged to a life that officially never existed. The bus stop was 6 blocks from Oak Creek Memorial, and the rain that had threatened all afternoon began to fall at 7:15 p.m. like a decision being made. By the time Ashley reached the corner of Victory and Bull, the box was disintegrating. The cardboard had soaked through completely, and the weight of a dying succulent, a small jade plant she'd been keeping alive on the break room windowsill for 3 years, had split the bottom seam open. She stood under the overhang of a closed hardware store and surveyed the damage. The world's okayest nurse mug had cracked along the handle. The tag had come off her name badge, leaving only the hospital logo. And the photograph, the one she'd kept tucked in the small pocket of her locker, the picture she wasn't supposed to keep, the evidence of a life that had been officially erased, was waterlogged but still intact. Rodriguez. Her spotter from Marjah. Frozen in that photograph at age 24, mid-laugh, his face tan and radiant and completely unaware that he had 72 hours left to live. Ashley pulled the photograph out and held it up to the streetlight. The rain ran down her hands, but her grip didn't waver. 18 years. 18 years since she'd carried a young Afghan translator through enemy fire with a sucking chest wound, and the translator had lived. He'd become a U.S. citizen. He'd joined the army. And 3 days ago, he'd lain in her OR and she'd saved his life a second time. But Rodriguez had not lived. None of the 12 operators had lived. Operation Serpent's Tail had been classified so thoroughly that even the Department of Defense's own files had been retroactively amended to remove any trace that the mission had ever happened. The operators were listed as killed in other operations, other places. Some weren't listed at all. The government had given Ashley a forged nursing diploma and instructions to disappear into American civilian life. Just another woman in scrubs. Just another person pushing medication carts and holding dying hands. No record. No service file. No medals locked away in a bank vault somewhere. Officially, Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper had never existed. 3 floors above the rain-soaked intersection where she was standing, Corporal Yasir Rahman's eyes opened in the recovery room. Soft lighting. Beeping monitors. The smell of antiseptic and the hiss of the ventilator that had breathed for him during surgery. He was alone except for the attending physician checking his vitals, a tall man with kind eyes and a stethoscope that he placed gently against Rahman's chest. "Welcome back, Corporal," the physician said. "You did great. The appendectomy went smoothly." Rahman's mouth was dry. His throat felt like it had been packed with sand. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. The attending held up a cup of water with a bendy straw, and Rahman drank, and the world came back into focus. The surgery had gone smoothly. Dr. Hargrove had not frozen. There had been no hemorrhage. No cardiac tamponade. No crisis. Except there had. Rahman remembered. The attending's face had gone pale. The surgical instruments had scattered. And then she had appeared, quiet, certain, moving with the precision of someone who had done this before. A spinal needle in her hand. 40 seconds. His heart had felt like it was being crushed under a stone, and then the pressure released, and air came back to his lungs, and he heard a voice, low, steady, utterly in command, saying, "Call blood bank. Type O negative. 2 units. Now." Not begging. Commanding. He sat up, despite the flare of pain along the incision site, and grabbed the attending's wrist. "The nurse," he gasped. "Where is the nurse?" "The woman who?" "Corporal, you need to rest." "Where is she?" His grip tightened. His heart monitor spiked. A 3-year-old memory surfaced, a voice cutting through the sound of gunfire, a hand pressing against his shoulder in the dark. A voice that said, "Stay with me. You're going to be American. You're going to be okay." The attending tried to pull his arm free. "Sir, we need to calm down." But Rahman was already reaching for his phone, his hand shaking badly enough that he nearly dropped it twice. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he hadn't called in 2 years, a number he shouldn't have had, a number that connected to a life that was supposed to stay classified. "Valkyrie," he shouted, and his voice cracked. "The nurse. Her name. Where is she?" An alarm bell sounded. Security was called. But Rahman's call was already going through, already ringing through the afternoon in a unit he wasn't supposed to be able to contact, reaching a man he wasn't supposed to know anymore, and the moment that phone was answered, everything changed. The rain continued to fall on Savannah, steady and patient, as though it knew something was coming. Ashley stood at the bus stop with a waterlogged cardboard box and a photograph of a dead man, watching the city lights blur and multiply in the wet dark. She had learned to endure silence. She had learned to accept erasure. She had learned to be no one. But somewhere 3 floors above her, a young ranger was about to teach them all that some people, once they see you clearly, will never let the world forget you again. 72 hours after Ashley saved a life and lost everything, Corporal Rahman woke in recovery with his hand already moving. The ICU nurse was checking his central line, and he grabbed her wrist with a grip that made her flinch, not from pain, but from the pure focused intensity of a man who'd just spent 3 days dreaming of names he couldn't speak. His voice came out raw, fractured from the breathing tube they'd pulled that morning. One word. A call sign. A name that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Valkyrie. The nurse stepped back. Code Blue? Seizure? Delirium? She was already reaching for the call button when Rahman's other hand shot out, trembling but precise, grabbing his phone from the bedside table. ICU protocol screamed no, post-operative patients weren't supposed to be using their phones, and he was still on 4-hydromorphone, still half-sedated, still technically in recovery. But she recognized something in his eyes that stopped her from stopping him. She'd seen it before in other patients, other soldiers. Not confusion. Clarity. Purpose. The kind that came from remembering something you'd been trying to forget. He dialed. His hand shook, but his voice didn't. "Sir, it's Rahman. I need to tell you something." He paused, listening. "The surgeon nicked my vena cava. I went into hemorrhagic shock. I should be dead." Another pause. His eyes fixed on the ceiling. There was a nurse. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis. 40 seconds. She saved my life. His voice cracked slightly. Her name was Valkyrie. But you already know that. Her real name is Ashley Cooper. The attending physician arrived 15 minutes later with security in tow, assuming a patient in post-operative narcotic haze was hallucinating. But Rahman was already off the phone, already asking for his discharge papers, already moving with a kind of purpose that made people step out of his way. 3 hours later, when Commander Marcus Vickers walked through the entrance of Oak Creek Memorial Hospital, he moved like a man with questions that required answers. His uniform was still crisp from the flight, dress blues with 4 rows of ribbons, seal trident polished bright enough to hurt. He didn't check in at reception. He went directly to the administrator's office on the 4th floor and knocked once, hard, the sound of knuckles on oak like a gavel. The hospital administrator looked up from his email. The board chairman was already there, summoned for what he thought was a budget meeting. Vickers walked in without waiting, and the room's pressure changed. Not anger. Worse than anger. Authority. The kind that came from having commanded men in places where decisions meant life or death. "You just terminated an employee," Vickers said. His voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. It had the texture of a tank idling in a garage, low and immense and capable of crushing everything around it. "Her name is Ashley Cooper. And you need to understand what you did." The administrator's face went pale before Vickers even continued. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, recipient of 2 Navy Crosses, for Purple Hearts, and the Silver Star for Operation Serpent's Tail. Each medal landed like a bullet. Each one changed the room's geometry. Served 12 years. 3 combat tours. Saved more lives in Helmand Province than most people save in a career. And you fired her for insubordination because she prevented your chief of surgery from killing a patient. The board chairman was already reaching for his phone. Vickers didn't move, but his presence made the air feel thinner. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The door opened. Special Agent Rebecca Chen walked in with a tablet and the kind of calm that only comes from having 3 years to build a case. She didn't wear a badge in the traditional sense, didn't need to. The federal prosecutors in her wake did that for her. FBI, she said simply. I'm Special Agent Chen. We've been investigating Dr. Richard Hargrove for 8 months regarding Medicare fraud. Billing for phantom procedures. Inflated surgical times. Kickback arrangements with medical device suppliers totaling approximately $2.3 million. She set the tablet on the table. It showed OR logs. Billing records. Procedure codes that didn't match actual surgeries. The paper trail of a man who'd gotten greedy and hadn't accounted for one variable, a nurse with military-grade attention to detail. Senior Chief Cooper's charting was too perfect, Chen continued. Too thorough. She noticed discrepancies after 6 weeks. Her medication counts cross-referenced against pharmacy logs. Her procedure documentation flagged against actual OR time. She was, inadvertently, building our case for us. Dr. Hargrove needed her gone before she could articulate what she was seeing. Chen looked at the administrator. You obliged. Which makes this hospital potentially liable for obstruction of a federal investigation. The administrator's hands trembled. The board chairman had already pushed his chair away from the table like proximity to Hargrove might be infectious. We had no knowledge of 17 procedures billed last month that never occurred, Chen said. Her voice was soft, which made it worse. Hargrove performed 6. Billed for 23. The discrepancies are in the OR logs. Nurse Cooper cross-referenced them during routine quality assurance reviews. The numbers don't lie. She slid a stack of declassified documents across the mahogany table. Operation Serpent's Tail. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, service record. Citations. Commendations. All the proof that the person they'd fired was exactly who the federal government had once erased. You can cooperate with our investigation, Chen said. Or be named as co-defendants in a federal fraud case totaling $2.3 million in false billing, plus criminal conspiracy. You have until Monday. Hargrove's hands moved to his phone before he could think better of it. His face had gone the color of raw steak. This is ridiculous. I have contacts at. His phone rang. He answered before thinking. Doug? Tell them. The voice on the other end was ice. His board chairman contact. Don't call this number again, Richard. Click. He tried the state nursing investigator next. Voicemail. His lawyer. Voicemail. The hospital's legal counsel stood slowly, like she was aging in real time. Dr. Hargrove, I'm advising you not to speak further. And I'm recommending to this board that your privileges be immediately suspended pending federal investigation. The vote was unanimous. 6 hands. No discussion. Within 90 seconds, he'd gone from chief of surgery to unemployed. Within 90 seconds, every network he'd cultivated, every favor he'd called in, every alliance he'd built came apart like tissue paper. His phone went dead quiet. Not because the calls stopped. Because no one was calling anymore. 20 years, Hargrove said. His voice had fractured. I gave this hospital 20 years. But the board had already moved to the next item on the agenda, damage control, legal strategy, how to frame the press release. He was still in the room, still breathing, still speaking, and he was already erased from the conversation. The administrator was already talking around him like he was furniture. Commander Vickers checked his watch. Senior Chief Cooper is currently at a bus station in Atlanta, trying to disappear. Again. He looked at the administrator. Someone should probably stop her before she does. The security guard who'd handed Ashley her cardboard box that rainy evening, name tag reading Jackson, 15 years service, received a call from the administrator 40 minutes later. Instructions. A name. A location. He left his post and drove to the Greyhound station on Martin Luther King Boulevard, where he found her sitting on a bench with that same water-damaged box, still trying to fold herself into invisibility. He sat down beside her without asking permission. There's someone at the hospital who needs to see you. She almost didn't look at him. But something in his voice made her turn, and recognition flashed. The same man who'd handed her the box. The same man who'd met her eyes that night with something other than judgment. "I need you to come back," Jackson said. "There's a SEAL commander in the administrator's office, and the FBI just shut down the entire billing operation." The drive back was silent except for the windshield wipers, rubber squeaking against glass in rhythm, a sound like a question being asked over and over. When she walked into that administrator's office, Vickers stood. Chen stood. The board chairman stood. It was Hargrove who remained sitting, face grey, hands trembling in a way she remembered him mocking in her sutures. The same security guard who'd handed her that box walked directly to Hargrove's office 40 minutes later. Hargrove was gathering his personal items with the mechanical precision of a man in shock. Jackson was holding something in his hands. Another cardboard box. Their eyes met in the mirror above Hargrove's desk. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," Jackson said quietly. Then he smiled, really smiled, for the first time. "Best moment of my career, actually." What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. It vindicated a woman the government had tried to erase. It proved that some people, once they see you clearly, will never let the world forget you again. 6 months later, Ashley Cooper runs Oak Creek Memorial's new Veteran Services program. The combat boots sit on her shelf, visible to every patient, scuffed, worn, real. Corporal Rahman visits monthly, healed and whole, bringing his sister and her children who call her Aunt Valkyrie. Dr. Hargrove teaches CPR basics at Savannah Community College for $18 an hour, handshaking as they did in that final moment, always wondering if anyone recognizes him from before. And Ashley Cooper's name is on the hospital directory now. Not redacted. Not erased. Not a shadow. A truth that couldn't be unmade. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And someone was finally watching. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please like this video and subscribe. Share Ashley's story with someone who needs to remember that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? The truth has a way of surfacing. Thank you for watching.